They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But if it happens to you enough, it probably means you made history. Gran Turismo is, without question, one of the most influential driving games ever made. Its formula has been adapted in some way by more or less every racing game released this millennium. But what happens when influence and inspiration become derivation and duplication? One question, many answers. So today I'm going to take a look at a few of them and tell you what I think. My list of games to talk about in this video kept growing and growing until it was unreasonably long, and most of them weren't very interesting or even that close to Gran Turismo. Many games flat out copied Gran Turismo's UI and menus, but don't share much outside that passing resemblance. So for the purposes of this video, my criteria for a GT clone are as follows. Either a one-off game, a spin-off, or the first entry in what will become a franchise that shares some combination of Gran Turismo's themes, structure, art style, or overall vibe. I'm also going to expand this circle to include any circuit racing game created by a Japanese developer that was a spin-off of a series that didn't normally do circuit racing. Yes, these criteria are pretty subjective, but I'm sure most of you will agree with my choices here. That said, I won't be talking about Sega GT. It's undeniably a GT clone, but it also has a much more important, expansive story that deserves to be told, and more time than I can give it in this video. And one last thing before we get started. Let me just say that I don't think being a Gran Turismo-like is a bad thing. Some of these games have grown to be genuine favorites of mine, and at the very least, I enjoyed almost all of them. Almost. Big thanks to G.Round for sponsoring today's video. G.Round is an up-and-coming service that matches indie developers with gamers looking for the latest indie games. By playing games on G.Round, you'll not only get to try the newest and most unique titles currently in development before anyone else, but you'll also be helping out the developers to refine their game, squash bugs, and get a general feel for what people think of their creations. One of the games I tried out is called Wreckout, a neat top-down blend of Breakout and Rocket League. It was fun, a really cool take on the car arena genre that I'd love to revisit with friends. New games are added all the time, and signing up is easy. Use the link in the description, create an account, download the launcher, and that's it. Then just play games, write reviews, and fill out surveys with questions written by the developers. You'll have fun, developers will get valuable feedback, and all the while you'll rack up points that can be redeemed for rewards, up to and including real swag like tumblers and headphones. This is a really cool app, like completely independent of being sponsored by them. I think it's an awesome idea that helps devs and players alike. So yeah, go try out G.Round with my promo link, and thanks once again to G.Round for sponsoring this video. When you think of Squaresoft, racing games probably aren't the first thing that come to mind. And no, Chocobo Racing does not count. Driving Emotion was only their second 3D driving game, the first being the cult classic Racing Lagoon for the original PlayStation. A game that, spoiler alert, is probably much more interesting to talk about. Because not only was it Square's first racing game, it was one of, if not the first racing role-playing games ever created. Let that sink in. Square made a proper driving JRPG in 1999, and this is likely the first time many of you have even heard of it. Based in the Japanese street racing scene of the late 80s and early 90s, Racing Lagoon features gorgeous visuals and some of the grooviest fusion jazz I've heard outside of Gran Turismo. Unfortunately, the game wasn't received all that well, but it's become a bit of a cult classic. Meaning that when I snagged my copy earlier this year, I had to pay over $50, and that number is only going up. My copy is positively gorgeous, but as it stands, I can't play it. No, seriously, I can't. Not really. Racing Lagoon was released to Japanese audiences in June of 1999, and that's it. No localization, no remaster, nothing. Square hasn't so much as acknowledged it since. Thankfully, a fan is finally working on translating it after all of these years, and they've recently released a work-in-progress patch that allows you to play through the prologue completely in English. So, as an aside, if you want to see this fascinating relic accessible by way more people the world over, please go support Hilltop on Patreon to help make it happen. As soon as that patch is complete, you can expect me to be among the first to share my thoughts. With Racing Lagoon in the rearview and the PlayStation 2 rapidly approaching, Square decided that their first game for Sony's console would be yet another racer, but this time without any birds or ridiculous haircuts. The Type S project would be headed up by Escape Co., an eternal team within Square made up of many of the same people responsible for both Racing Lagoon and Chocobo Racing. Which sounds like a good thing, until you realize that Square took people whose previous racing experience was comprised solely of birds and tasked them with copying the most successful driving simulator ever brought to market. Japanese audiences did seem to like driving a motion Type S well enough, but when eager Western journalists got their hands on imported PS2s and Japanese copies of the game, things were less positive, to say the least. IGN called Type S the worst PlayStation 2 game money could buy, citing oversensitive controls that were at odds with the game's demanding physics. Due to being one of only 2 racing games available on the system during its first month in the market, alongside Ridge Racer 5, the game did sell reasonably well in Japan, but Square was clearly concerned about reception across the pond. It didn't take long for the publisher to announce that Type S would receive a physics and handling overhaul, along with new content that would appeal to American audiences. Wait, guys, I think I've heard this one before. These changes meant that Type S didn't release in America until January of 2001, nearly 2 months after the system released. Now keep in mind that by the time this game finally came out in the US, the system's racing game selection had expanded quite a bit. Midnight Club, Smuggler's Run, Choro Q, Formula 1, NASCAR, and more had all shown up to fill the gap in the library that Type S had previously occupied during the Japanese launch. So, to positively no one's surprise, driving a motion Type S was an absolute flop at retail, selling a grand total of 2,500 copies in its first week. For reference, Midnight Club doubled that in the very same week, and it had been out for 3 months already. I'm not really sure why it bombed so hard, to be honest. Critics seemed appeased by the American version of the game, if not entirely satisfied. But enough with the history lesson. I can't tell you what it was really like to play it until I play it for myself. This was an improvement? Driving a motion Type S is an incredibly frustrating video game, because everything about its presentation, graphics, music, the vehicles on offer, all of it is great. It even managed to snag the Ferrari license a decade before Gran Turismo did. But this game, guys, I am not joking when I say I could not win a race in driving a motion Type S. I like to think I know what I'm doing. I don't find most 2000s racing games to be much of a challenge anymore, but this is uncontrollable. That quote about Test Drive 4 feeling like driving a car while on medication comes to mind. The thing just slips and slides all over the asphalt, as if it had been thoroughly rubbed down with lube. I've been wanting to play this game for ages because the box art and title are very cool. I went into this hoping it would be another situation where I love the game everybody else hates. That I'd be able to make this video and tell you about how misunderstood driving a motion Type S was. But nah, guys, this fucking sucks, and I only lasted about 15 minutes before shutting it off and moving on to the next game. Most of the footage you're seeing is courtesy of a friend, Racing Game Archive, because I just could not bring myself to keep playing it. So that was a lot of build-up for such an anticlimactic end. But like I said, I've heard this exact story before. I covered Auto Modelista last year, but for those who haven't seen the review, the long and short of it is that the Japanese version was vastly superior, thanks to Capcom positively ruining the game in a feeble attempt to win over American audiences. So, as much as I'd like to never touch driving a motion Type S again, I have to know. Was the Japanese version better? Honestly, no, but it wasn't any worse either. At first, I thought the Miata handled okay, but as soon as I entered a proper race, I realized how prone your car still is to becoming a 3,000-pound yo-yo. I've never written this much about a game I've played for less than 30 minutes, but that time was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. But on a positive note, things can only get better from here. If driving a motion Type S was Square's answer to Gran Turismo 3, Entusia was Konami's answer to Gran Turismo 4. Konami really hadn't made anything in this vein before. Their back catalog of driving game consists entirely of arcade games and kart racers. Entusia and Type S often get lumped into the same category, and it's understandable, really. Both are PS2 exclusives, both are undeniable Gran Turismo knockoffs made by companies that don't normally make realistic racing games, and both have been more or less forgotten by all but the most devoted racing game fans. This reputation has prevented me from giving Entusia a proper try for years. Hearing it mentioned in the same breath as a game as universally hated as Type S did not inspire confidence. Yet, booting it up for the first time led to one of the most enjoyable gaming sessions I've had in recent memory. Make no mistake, Entusia is copying Gran Turismo's aesthetics, if the cover and logo type didn't make that obvious. It has that same unapologetically Japanese design, that same enthusiasm for quirky, weird, or even just mundane cars. But I was pleasantly surprised to find out that not only was this a good Gran Turismo knockoff, it even did quite a few things better. License tests are simultaneously less frustrating than GTs, while managing to be more helpful in teaching the player how to drive. This game is going to make you a better racer, just like Gran Turismo. It actually solves a problem that most GT games have, that being the lack of punishment for cutting corners or driving dirty to win. Rather than strictly prohibiting cheating, Entusia instead encourages your honesty by gamifying it. The cleaner you drive, the better your score. This unique ranking system punishes losing streaks and rewards even middling results, giving each race actual stakes even if you don't plan to win. This was actually one of the game's selling points. The back of the box boasts that the odds system keeps all vehicles competitive, and honestly, it does. Unlike Gran Turismo's points, odds actually make a meaningful difference in your ranking by multiplying your winnings. If you outdrive a car to beat much more capable machines, you will be rewarded handsomely compared to if you just picked the best car in your garage. To that end, the game encourages you to change things up, while also rewarding dedication to your favorite cars. Winning levels up your car makes it better, but that simultaneously makes your odds better and means returns will diminish. So yeah, you get to improve your car, but if you want to keep climbing the ranks at an impressive pace, you'll have to utilize more of your collection to do so. It's a very refreshing take on the car RPG, a genre that was only just getting started during the PS2 era. Other games in this subgenre, like Evolution GT and Alfa Romeo Racing Italiano, tended to focus so much on the RPG elements that it distracted from normal racing gameplay, which was typically not that great to begin with. Entusia bucks this trend by being a genuinely good racing game first, and lets the RPG mechanics enhance that instead of taking center stage. Entusia gives you a heat map of collisions, top speeds, hard braking, and overtakes after each race, so you can study your performance. The default camera view has a G-force graph on screen at all times, helping you to understand exactly why the car is behaving how it is in every situation. To that point, each car is incredibly different from the others in terms of personality and handling characteristics. The Honda Beat I started in is incredibly slow in a straight line, but since it weighs nothing, it's very tossable. The Type R sedan was fast, but quite a bit heavier and thus not the best at braking from speed, making it much less nimble through the corners. The 2000 GT is old and it feels old, being far more slippery and difficult to handle than newer cars. I swear I have never played any racing game where the cars feel this distinct from one another, not even Gran Turismo. And since the game urges you to change cars frequently, Entusia feels continually fresh, and you never feel like you're falling into a routine. I can't think of any other game that actively encourages you to drive something like a Chevy Astrovan, which, by the way, makes its one and only licensed video game appearance right here in Entusia. The career mode is structured in days, with each day featuring a unique set of events tailored to the car you're driving. You can see the track, the other cars you'll be competing against, and the odds your current vehicle has of winning. When you perform well in events, there's a lottery to determine which, if any, of the opponent's cars you win for yourself. You only complete one event per day, and if you choose to change cars or take a rest, the day ends. So there are quite a few factors playing into your decision here. Do you go for a race you've got a good chance of winning, or do you pick a harder race in hopes of getting a car you've been pining after? This unique career mode meshes really well with the quirky presentation and rewarding driving sim aspects to provide an experience that is altogether likable, unique, and memorable. Sure, it's not as likable or memorable as Gran Turismo, but I don't really understand why the game's reception was so... Oh. That'll do it. Entusia is a very pretty game, but I was surprised to learn it released in 2005. It's not as visually impressive as GT4 and has far less content. That said, there are a few genuine shortcomings here that have nothing to do with Gran Turismo. I'm not saying they justify the low reception, but they are worth mentioning. That vehicle lottery system might be unique and interesting at first, but has the unfortunate side effect of making it basically impossible to obtain a vehicle you really want without trying over and over. Y'all know me, if a game has a Mazda RX-8, you'll see it in a good chunk of my footage, but unfortunately I just couldn't obtain one in my 5 or so hours with the game. I don't think I should have to flip a coin between obtaining an RX-8 or a minivan in a game where there is no other way to obtain cars. The absolute worst is when the spinner lands on nothing and you don't get a car at all for your trouble. As long as I'm complaining, there is a bit of a track variety problem too, especially in the early hours. There are more tracks in the game unlocked in the later stages, but in order to get to those later stages, you'll be driving around the same few tracks ad nauseum. There's a dirt stage and a rainy track, but in the lower performance vehicles you'll be driving on them, those things serve more to frustrate the player than to mix things up, especially if you're having trouble building a collection. Minor gripes aside, Entusia is an oft overlooked and underrated game that really deserves more attention. Its obvious inspiration aside, Entusia does enough of its own thing to set itself apart as more than just another Gran Turismo clone. It's fast becoming one of my favorite PS2 racing games, and in truth, it's far and away the best game I played for this video. Bear with me because I'm going to keep this short and sweet. I don't think it's fair to treat the whole Forza franchise as a Gran Turismo clone by any means. The two franchises have gone very different directions in recent years, and while they may have similar audiences, they have very different attitudes to them that I struggle to put into words. To me, the modern Gran Turismo modus operandi is elegance. GT Sport was made with the spirit of competition in mind. In contrast, Forza Motorsport 7 seems to want to be a more visceral experience, centered on the cars and racing itself. My perception is that Turn 10 were still trying to find their footing with the first two Forza games. They were trying to straddle that line between doing their own thing and competing with Gran Turismo. I don't think anyone would argue that Forza wasn't created to do exactly that. After all, Microsoft didn't really have anything else in the Xbox's lineup that checked the same boxes. PGR was great, but it was far more arcadey and unlikely to convert any Gran Turismo veterans to the green team. Forza sold systems, especially in the 360 era, during the 6-year drought between GT4 and GT5. Now, I've admittedly played a lot less of Forza Motorsports 1 through 3 than the rest of the franchise. I had them back in the day, sure, but they didn't grab me the way games like Need for Speed did. It wasn't until my teens that I became interested in more grounded racing games, and at that point, Forza 4 was all the rage. Now that said, I have played Forza Motorsport 1 online a fair bit in the last couple of years, thanks to X-Link Kai. If I was to point out one thing that set FM1 and 2 apart from Gran Turismo, it would almost certainly be these online capabilities. Otherwise, these games feel like what you'd get if you put an American coat of paint on Gran Turismo 4. The games look and run great, especially on 360. And Forza 2 beat Gran Turismo 5 to market by a whopping 3 years, giving the 360 a nice head start in the online racing department. Still, these games had sizable single-player modes with plenty of cars and content. In truth, Forza 1's career feels a bit slow and restrictive compared to later entries, but it is interesting to see just how many of the franchise's staple features were here right from the start. Brand affinity, difficulty bonuses, and leveling were the first things I noticed, but even the physics felt similar. Some part of me honestly suspects there's ancient FM1 code still lurking in Horizon 4's driving model. Aside from literally existing to battle Gran Turismo at retail, another reason I consider Forza to be a GT clone is the car selection. They were gunning hard for the Japanese touring car fans with this one, and there's also a lot of big aftermarket names here. Tom's, for example, has a sizable presence, and the sequel would only take this further. With all of that being said, if you're gonna play an early Forza, we're talking the first 3 here, I genuinely recommend Forza Motorsport 2. It feels a lot like a remaster of the first game, running at 720p and 60 FPS. Motorsport 2 also has the added benefit of feeling, well, finished. FM1's HUD, UI, and such all looked like placeholders. FM2's looked much more polished and unique. As for why I recommend it over Motorsport 3, I feel the second entry is still quite different from the rest of the series. FM3 introduced Rewind and the franchise's new presentation and art style that would carry it on through Forza 4 and 5. Forza 3 feels like an early build of Forza 4, which isn't really a bad thing, but it does mean there's little reason to return to 3. On the other hand, Forza 2 feels like a competent preemptive strike, aimed at Gran Turismo 5's forthcoming PS3 debut. Now, I can already hear the Forza stands slamming angrily on the keyboard about how all that was just a coincidence, so I'm gonna leave the Forza talk here. Instead, let's talk about a game so undeniably inspired by Gran Turismo that its developer didn't even bother changing the name. Listen, I know GT stands for all kinds of other car terms, but come on, just look at this. Pretty shameless, but I will give it a pass for 2 reasons. First, this is technically the second game in MTO's GT series after Pocket GT, a Game Boy Color game in a similar, albeit much lower fidelity vein. That's the same MTO responsible for a wide variety of 90s racing games, such as Option Tuning Car Battle on PS1 and Initial D Gaiden on the Game Boy, on which Pocket GT is seemingly based. The other reason GT Advance gets a pass is that this is a seriously good translation of Gran Turismo for handhelds. It's obviously nowhere near as realistic, with tracks that are noticeably flatter than any place on Earth, and physics that handsomely reward drifting with a boost of speed rather than a reduction. Get past all that though, and this game scratches the handheld Gran Turismo itch perfectly. The car roster here is seriously incredible. It's not as all-encompassing as Gran Turismo's, but it has basically all the sporty vehicles in that game's roster. The obvious JDM icons are here, but along with it comes the Toyota Chaser, Nissan Cube, and who could forget the Daihatsu Microaggression. All of them can be swapped between at will and upgraded with parts unlocked by winning races. The cars feel much more distinct from one another than you'd expect from a GBA game. In general, it plays much better than other GBA racers, though that's not exactly a high bar. The pseudo 3D effect looks leagues better than the full 3D games on the system, like Need for Speed or Tokyo Extreme Racer Advance. However, the game still falls into many of the same traps as its competitors. Even with the pace notes, it's sometimes hard to see where the intended path is, especially on the city tracks. On a completely flat, open plane intended to be viewed on a 2-inch screen, having unused streets visible was not a good idea. Worse, invisible walls are present but used sporadically, so while sometimes you'll run wide without penalty, sometimes you'll just hit a wall immediately even though there shouldn't be one there. Collision physics rob you of basically all your speed, and when it's another car bumping into you over and over, it gets really frustrating. In honesty, a dedicated player could probably take down GT Advance in one sitting. But apparently I am not that dedicated player, because I made it about halfway through before getting frustrated and going to bed. It's fun enough, don't get me wrong, but it is quite telling that even the best racers on the GBA have the same problems that afflict the worst. GT Advance received a pair of sequels, one focused on rally racing and another serving as a more direct follow-up to the first game. More interestingly though, MTO brought the game to living rooms with GT Cube, a Japanese exclusive adaptation for GameCube. In the West, we eventually got the game as GT Pro Series on the Wii, but if I'm being honest, the motion controls only harm the experience. Unsurprisingly, it's basically just GT Advance with fully 3D environments. There's not really much to indicate an attempt at adding depth to GT Cube, or to get it closer to Gran Turismo in terms of content or mechanics. It's an incredibly simple game, to a fault actually. The game's limited scope was fine on GBA, but on console, standards were a bit higher by 2003. The cel-shaded art style was cool, but comes off a bit undercooked compared to Auto Modelista. It all feels a bit low effort, doubly so for the Wii version, and review scores reflected that. And with that, the franchise was never heard from again, and unfortunately MTO's output from 2006 onward consists solely of dogs, cats, and other DS shovelware. Supposedly they're still active, but they haven't done anything since 2008, and Wikipedia lists their employee count as 4. So I don't buy it. And that's a shame, because I feel like there really is a market for a first-party racing game on the Switch. Something to tackle Forza and Gran Turismo. The title, Racing Battles C1 Grand Prix, is so generic that during the research and writing of this video, I've written the words in the wrong order at least 5 times. But for fans of Tokyo Extreme Racer, that name is probably setting off some big alarm bells. And yes, this is a spin-off of the Shotoko Battle franchise, known in the West as Tokyo Extreme Racer. Even if you didn't suss that out from the Genki logos plastered all over the game, it wouldn't take long to start running into some familiar mechanics and design language. I like Tokyo Extreme Racer well enough. It's far from my favorite franchise. I find it can get to be a bit repetitive and boring pretty quickly. But I own all the games, and I find myself booting one of them up every couple months, just to roll around the loop until I inevitably get bored again and shut it off. C1 Grand Prix Battle Racing, or whatever the fuck this game is called, is basically just Tokyo Extreme Racer in the daylight with the Tsukuba circuit added on for variety. Unlike the rest of the franchise, this game never left Japan. The career mode is structured like TXR in that it's divided into days. Each day has specific events and opportunities, but you can only take part in one, and when you return to the garage, the next day begins. There are 3 types of event here. SP Battle is the same exact thing as Tokyo Extreme Racer. You roll around the circuit in free roam, roll up behind random street racers, and flash your lights to start a rolling race. There's a way to select different tiers of battle, including a best of 3, but I've only ever activated them on accident, and truthfully I have no idea how I did so. Other than that, there are RP battles, otherwise known as races. Genki really love their obscure, nonsensical terminology, don't they? I believe RP stands for Racing Points, and refers to these 100 points you start each race with. Hitting walls, running wide, or contacting other cars makes you lose a point. But from what I can tell, it doesn't seem to matter, as long as you don't hit 0. And even my sleep-deprived ass nodding off while playing in the wee hours of the morning didn't hit 0. Last of all, and probably my least favorite, we have DP. Drift Point Battles. Weird that it's here, given that this game released the same year as Kaido Battle Legend of the Past, otherwise known as TXR Drift 2. Then again, the rest of the game is just TXR, so eh. There is a 4th event each day, and it's a bit of a wild card. You must have earned enough points from the other events to buy your way in, and it's usually an event in a loaned car. Sometimes, though, it's a unique event in your own car, like a drag race. I like the idea of this wildcard event, but honestly, it usually falls flat. In some time trial events, you'll be doing 5-minute laps of the C1, just like in TXR, but without the fun part of TXR being the rolling races. And if you make a mistake, there's no restart. You have to stew in your frustration until the next lap begins, or give up entirely. I had a similarly frustrating experience with the lone car races too, because I never encountered rain before one of these, but was suddenly tasked with winning a race in an unfamiliar car while encountering the game's wet weather physics for the very first time, all with no chance to restart. And this last one wasn't the game's fault, but when I went to a drag race, I didn't realize I had to wait until the green to press the gas pedal, expecting the game to hold the clutch for me like many other games. But no, I jumped to the start and was immediately disqualified with no option to retry. To its credit, Racing Boogaloo does a fair bit to set itself apart from other generic track racers. Depending on your opinion of the TXR games, The resemblance to Shitoku Battle could be charming. The car customization is pretty fantastic, especially given that most games aiming for realism around this time tended to have pretty limited customization, Gran Turismo included. I also absolutely love the graphic design and general vibe of the game. The logo and intro are neat, and while the bosses and factions are undeniably pulled straight from TXR, it's worth mentioning that those aspects are completely unique to Genki's games. I'll never complain about running into Rolling Guy. I did question whether or not Z1 GP qualifies as a Gran Turismo clone, to the extent that I actually considered cutting it from this video. But a couple things kept it here. For one, I doubt I'd ever find an excuse to talk about it at length outside of this context. But more significantly, I feel like a Genki would never have made something like this if they weren't aiming for a slice of the Gran Turismo crowd. Unfortunately though, their inexperience with this particular discipline of racing game means that Racing Battle is pretty unexceptional, playing more like TXR 3.5 than anything original. Playing C1 Grand Prix hot off the heels of an Entusia session only served to highlight how much the game just doesn't stack up to the best racers of 2005. And crucially, it proves a point I've been trying to drive home for years. The racing genre is a massive one with many distinct subsectors, and success in one will not necessarily translate to another. Speaking of which... If you've not sussed it out from the title, UI, or these, this is a Ridge Racer spinoff, but unlike Racing Battle, it shares very little with its parent franchise. Ridge Racer is about as arcade as it gets, but R expects a lot more patience. I've mentioned in the past that games like Test Drive Unlimited and Gran Turismo enable the player to almost roleplay through the types of vehicles they choose to drive, creating their own personal narrative through gameplay. But I've not spent much time exploring the opposite end of that spectrum, when racing games have a solid, fixed narrative with established characters and plot points. Done wrong, they can trash a game's reputation, but done correctly, they give fans of the genres a unique twist on familiar formulas, while enticing newcomers with something that isn't a fancy car on the cover. Our racing evolution falls somewhere between these two extremes. It's not a super ambitious narrative or anything, but it's generally well animated and tackles topics that are explicitly related to motorsport, which is something I can get behind since most racing movies and games with narratives tend to stray into crime to keep non-fans from dozing off. You play as Rena, or Reina depending on which character is pronouncing her name. She's an ambulance driver that saves the life of a racing driver injured at Twin Wing Motegi. The race engineer, Stefan, is impressed by Rena's driving and offers her a trial run with the team. She drives the Pantera in a circle for 3 laps, they put her through rally training for some reason, and that somehow qualifies her to drive proper touring car races on city circuits. Early on, she's accosted by Gina, the only other female driver in the paddock, who, by coincidence, also doesn't wear a shirt under her racing overalls. Gina hates Rena's team because they're owned by a big corporation called GVI, who are responsible for match fixing. Something Rena finds out herself when she's forced to finish second place on purpose. There's honestly not much going on here. Outside of forcing the player to concede one race, the story is basically a non-factor, and cutscenes can be skipped without consequence. The game's other gimmick does at least pertain to gameplay, where driving close behind opponents and acting as if you're going to make a move intimidates them. You hear the reactions over the radio, but they're incredibly overacted and not in a fun way. Fill the bar, which doesn't really take much doing, and it causes them to spin. Can I just say for a second, fuck mechanics like this. Namco wanted you to believe that these professional race car drivers can't have a rookie in their slipstream for 3 seconds without developing brain damage and causing horrific crashes. It feels incredibly undercooked and tacked on at best, and at worst, the AI spins out on a straight and crashes into you, directly damaging your chances of winning. Otherwise, the driving model is mostly good. Like driving a Motion Type S, it suffers from oversensitivity, albeit to a much lesser degree. The bigger problem is the camera, which is so far up the car's ass that it becomes impossible to use. That'll be why most of my footage of this game is in the bumper cam, because without it, driving in R is just unpleasant. As long as you're in first person though, it generally feels nice once you get used to it. Rally stages are the exception. They never feel good, and by the time you get used to them, you're back to asphalt. And the same goes for the singular drag strip. First impressions are forever, and R Racing Evolution comes off as a simple, by-the-numbers circuit racing game, with a story that does little beyond weekly connect these seemingly unrelated race events. Again, this is only a Gran Turismo clone, in that I doubt there would have been a Ridge Racer circuit racing spinoff if not for GT's influence. In truth, this game is closer to the original Toka Race Driver, which would eventually become Grid. Now coincidentally, Pro Race Driver came out around the same time as R Racing Evolution, and it also featured a story mode. But while R lacked track variety and ultimately received forgettable reviews, Race Driver did well enough to become a series it is still going to this day, albeit without a narrative. As mixed as I feel about this game, it's honestly a shame that Namco never took another shot at this formula, because the presentation, music, and atmosphere are all on point. The characters and cutscenes are even likable enough. All it needed was a bit more effort in the story department and overall better execution, both of which I feel could have come with time in the oven. Unfortunately, with the way other racing game stories have been received since, I don't think we'll ever get another game quite like our Racing Evolution. Influence Gran Turismo has had on the racing genre cannot be overstated. Gran Turismo was so unique at the time that it honestly started its own subgenre. Clones, knockoffs, whatever you want to call them, these games rightfully emulated one of the most important landmarks in racing game history. I could rattle off a dozen games right now that I could have talked about in this video, but there were only so many hours in a day. The takeaway is that there will always be room for new ideas and innovations in the racing game space. Some work, some don't, and some fall through the cracks. But the best thing that you as a player can do is to give them a chance. This video led me to finally enjoy Entusia and Racing Evolution after years of both games sitting idly on my shelf. And if I've convinced even a few of you to pick them up and try them for yourself, well, then I've done my job. Hey, thanks for watching, and thanks for your patience while I worked on this video. I know this was a longer wait than normal, but this video's scope grew way larger than I intended, and before I knew it, I was looking at 30 plus minutes of script to patch together. I ended up cutting a couple games from the final product, namely Group S Challenge, which I went as far as writing and voicing over the script for, but ultimately decided what I was saying could be boiled down to, this game is fucking boring, don't play it. It broke the flow of the video, and honestly, it wasn't worth my time to edit it or yours to watch it. If you really care about Group S Challenge for some reason, I'll probably add on to that section of the script and upload it on Patreon in the next couple days. Also, now that I'm mostly settled into the new house, you can expect a behind the scenes video of the new office studio setup soon, and patrons will likely get first access to that video. Also, you can expect at least 2 more videos before the end of the month. These will be a bit shorter than normal in the interest of making them easier for me to work on in such short order, but I've got sponsor deadlines to meet, and this video was supposed to come out a week ago. On that topic, another big thanks to G.Round for sponsoring this video and for their patience with me as I recovered from wisdom tooth extraction. Seriously, they were great to work with, and their product is really cool, so please consider checking them out as a way of saying thanks and supporting the channel. The Q&A will resume soon, video after next, schedule permitting. But today I'm gonna kick it old school and do a patron readout. So, big thanks to Vi Kinney, Acquire86, Adam Wozniewski, Adam Yee, Alex Stowe, Alex Cutler, Alex Fay, An Immortal Snake, Andre Nagura, Andrew Elmore, Andrew Lashinsky, Atmer, Bad Game Hall of Fame, Brendan, Carson Walker, Chox Gaming, Comrade Chloe, Dak Pate, Daniel Brackenberry, Dave Blair, Diogo Rodriguez, Dr. Pepper, Duthmala Weston, Dilberg, Eric Lynn, Evan Gaithis, oh, buddy, I'm sorry, Fairy Scion Josephine, Glenn Fordham, Hill Webden, Loss? Is this fucking Loss? Iced Car and Coco, Jacob Bartels, Jacob Clark, Jake, Jamie Benton, Jamie Day, Jesus Gonzalez, John Stefanelli, Kai M, Kat Katsuke, Kelly Craven, Logan Unstedt, Martin Rivard, Mike Kuhn, Mini-Me, Morgan, Neon Puma, Nika Crispy, Omisan, Peter Zhang, Rachel, Racing Game Archive, Robert the Jaguar, Rami Raccoon, Robert Paredes, Robin Broberg, Ryan Kowalkowski, Sarah Colley, Scarlet O, Shining Wing, Silent, Steeliest Guns, Xavier Fidam, Tanis, Turk, The Gaming Badger, Thiago Capuano, Thibaut Renault, Thunder THR, Tenensdelian, Will Thomas, William Foster, Yajia Zhu, Young Raymond Davides, and 0567. It's been a long time since I've done a full patron readout, so if I pronounce your names wrong, I'm so sorry. Please correct me in the comments and it won't happen again. I'm sorry about that, guys. But yeah, thank you so much for supporting me. Y'all are helping keep me afloat right now, and it means a lot. Anyways, I'll see you guys soon.